The morning after the divorce was finalized, Frances Calloway stood in her garage and looked at what was left. Not much. Martin had taken the tools, the good ones, the ones that had hung on the pegboard in their specific places for 35 years, outlined in black marker so you always knew where everything belonged. He had taken the workbench his father had built. He had taken the cabinets along the back wall, and the shop vacuum, and the extension cords wound on their orange reels. He had taken, with the comprehensive thoroughness of a man who had spent 4 months working with an attorney to establish exactly what was legally his, everything that could be argued to belong to him. What remained was the garage itself, the concrete floor with its oil stain in the shape of something vaguely like a running dog that had been there since they moved in, the bare pegboard with its ghost outlines of the tools that had hung there, the single fluorescent tube above humming faintly, the smell of sawdust and machine oil that had soaked into the walls over 3.5 decades and could not be itemized or assigned to either party, and so had stayed. Frances was 67 years old. She had retired from teaching high school English 6 months earlier, at the end of the spring term, with a party in the gymnasium and a card signed by every student she had taught that year, and a ceramic mug that said "Best Teacher," in a font that had always seemed to her slightly too cheerful for the sentiment. She had retired into a marriage she had believed was solid, and a life she had believed was settled, and a future she had believed was reasonably well understood. 3 months after she retired, Martin told her he was leaving. He had been seeing someone. It had been going on for 2 years. He was sorry. He had already spoken to an attorney. Frances stood in the empty garage the morning after the divorce was finalized and looked at the bare pegboard and the oil stain and the humming fluorescent tube, and she felt something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not quite grief, and not quite rage, and not quite the hollow disorientation of someone whose map has been taken away. It was something more like the feeling of a room that has been emptied and is waiting. She had spent 35 years in a marriage and 6 months in a retirement, and she was 67 years old and standing in an empty garage, and the question that arrived, quietly and without drama, was, now what? If you have ever stood in a space that used to hold something and found yourself looking at what it could become instead of what it was, if you have ever been handed an empty room at exactly the moment you needed one, if you believe that what we build with our own hands in the years when no one is watching is sometimes the most important thing we ever make, then stay with us. Because what Frances Calloway built in that empty garage did not just leave the street speechless. It gave her back something that 35 years of being careful and responsible and other things for other people had slowly and quietly taken. This is her story. Frances had married Martin Calloway in June of 1988, the summer after they both finished graduate school. She had a master's degree in English literature and a job offer from Millbrook High School in Millbrook, Tennessee, where she had grown up, and where her parents still lived, and where the teaching position had felt, at 26, like a beginning rather than a destination. Martin had a degree in mechanical engineering and a position with a manufacturing firm in Nashville, which was 40 minutes from Millbrook and manageable. The house on Sycamore Street had been her parents' suggestion and her choice. A 2-story craftsman with a deep front porch and a detached garage, and a backyard large enough for the garden she intended to plant and the life she intended to build. She had paid attention to the garage specifically, the way people pay attention to the features of a house that correspond to something they already know about themselves. She had grown up watching her father work with wood in a garage very much like this one, and she had learned beside him with the particular absorption of a child for whom a parent's serious work is the most interesting thing in the world. She had not pursued it as a young woman in the way her father's work had seemed to invite her to pursue it. There had been graduate school, and the teaching position, and the marriage, and the years of building a life that had room for many things, but had somehow never quite made room for the workbench she had imagined. This was not a tragedy. It was the ordinary compression of a full life, the way the things we intend for ourselves get deferred, not because we forget them, but because the present is always more immediately demanding than the future. Martin had filled the garage. This was a reasonable thing. He was an engineer, and he worked with tools on weekends, and the garage was the natural place for his tools and his projects, and the half-finished things that engineers accumulate in the way that people accumulate the things they are genuinely interested in. Frances had not objected. She had her classroom and her books and her students and the garden in the backyard and a marriage that had been good for longer than it had been not good, which was something she held on to in the months of the divorce, when the temptation was to revise the entire history in the light of its ending. 35 years, 2 children who were now adults living in other cities, a career that had given her more than she had given it, which is the mark of work you were meant to do. A house on Sycamore Street that was in both their names and that the divorce settlement had assigned to her, which was the one thing Martin's lawyers had not been able to take, perhaps because even they could see that taking the house would have been a step beyond what the law required and toward something that looked too clearly like what it was. She had the house. She had the empty garage. She had, at 67, more time than she had ever had in her adult life and less certainty about what to do with it than she had experienced since she was 22. Her daughter called that morning. Claire was 34 and lived in Portland and worked in architecture and had her mother's eyes and her own very particular opinions about most things. She called to ask how Frances was doing, and Frances said she was fine in the way mothers say they are fine to their children when they are not fine and do not want to transfer the weight of that to someone who cannot do anything about it from Portland. Claire said, "Mom, what are you actually doing today?" Frances said, "I am standing in the garage." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does it look like?" Frances looked around. She said, "It looks like a room that has been emptied out and is waiting for something." Claire said, "That sounds about right." Then she said, "Mom, do you remember what you used to say you were going to do when you had time?" Frances said, "I said a lot of things." Claire said, "You said you were going to learn to do what Grandpa did. You said it every time we visited him. You said, 'when I have time.'" Well, there was a pause. Frances looked at the bare pegboard, at the ghost outlines of the tools, at the oil stain in the shape of a running dog. She said, "I need to go make a list." Claire said, "Call me when you have the list." Frances went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list. It had 12 items on it. The first item was, "Find out what tools I actually need." The last item was, "Call Dad." She called her father that afternoon. He was 91 and still living in the house where she had grown up, still with the garage she had learned in, still with opinions about wood that had not softened with age. He listened to what she told him, and then he said, "Well, it is about time." She said, "I know." He said, "Write this down." She wrote it down. She spent the first month learning what she did not know, which was a great deal. She had the foundation her father had built in her when she was a girl, the understanding of grain and joinery, the patience for the slow work, the ability to read a piece of wood the way you read a face, looking for what it is rather than what you want it to be. But foundation is not the same as practice, and she had 35 years of not practicing, which meant that the first month was a month of relearning the relationship between what her hands knew and what they could actually do. She bought tools carefully and with research, the way she bought everything. She had watched her father spend money on tools her entire childhood and had absorbed his hierarchy of values on the subject. Buy the best quality you can afford for the things you will use constantly, and accept no compromise there. Be more flexible on the things you will use occasionally, and never buy something because it is on sale if you do not already know exactly why you need it. The workbench came first. She built it herself, which was both a practical decision and a statement she needed to make to herself about what the garage was going to be and who it was going to belong to. She worked from a design her father described over the phone, modifying it for her height and her reach, which were different from his. It took 3 weekends and was not perfect. The joinery on the left leg was not as tight as she wanted it. She looked at it and decided it was good enough for a first bench and that she would build a better one in a year. The neighbors noticed. Millbrook was the kind of town where people noticed what was happening in their neighbors' garages, particularly when the garage door was open and unfamiliar sounds were coming out of it. Harriet Webb, from 2 doors down, knocked on the side door one Saturday morning and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than intrusion, what Frances was making. Frances showed her the workbench she had just finished. Harriet looked at it for a moment and said, "That is a very serious workbench." Frances said, "Yes, it is." Harriet said, "Good for you," and went back to her house. She started with small things. A cutting board for her own kitchen, then 2 more as gifts for the neighbors who had brought food in the weeks after the divorce. A small shelf for the bathroom, a box with a fitted lid for her daughter Claire, who had asked for something to keep her drawing supplies in. Each piece taught her something. Each piece was slightly better than the last in at least one specific way, which is all you can ask of practice. Her son called from Chicago. He was 32 and worked in finance, and approached most things with the analytical caution of someone who has learned to be careful about enthusiasm. He asked what she was doing with her time. She told him. There was a pause, and then he said, "Woodworking?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Like actual woodworking with tools?" She said, "Yes, Daniel." He said, "Huh." Then he said, "Are you making anything I could have?" She said, "What do you need?" He said, "I don't know. Something for the apartment." She said, "I'll think about it." She thought about it for 3 weeks, and then built him a small side table in walnut, the first time she had worked with walnut, which is a wood that requires attention and rewards it. The grain came out better than she had expected. She looked at it when it was finished and thought, "I am getting somewhere." The chair was not planned. This was how she described it afterward, when people asked how it had started. She said the chair was not planned, which was true in the sense that she had not set out one morning with the intention of building something that would change the direction of her life. She had set out to build a chair because she needed one for the garage, and the ones at the hardware store were either too expensive or not what she wanted. And it had occurred to her, on a Tuesday in November, 14 months after she started working in the garage, that she could make exactly what she wanted. She had been thinking about chairs for some time. About what makes a chair good, which is a question that sounds simpler than it is. A good chair requires the understanding of how a human body sits and what it needs from the thing it is sitting on, and it requires the translation of that understanding into joinery that is strong enough to hold the stress of use over years and elegant enough that the structure does not overwhelm the form. She had been reading about chairs. She had studied the work of the craftspeople whose chairs she admired. She had spent time sitting in chairs she considered good and thinking about why they worked. The chair she built took 6 weeks. Cherry wood, which she had chosen for its warmth and its behavior over time, the way it deepens with age and use, to a color that is almost impossible to reproduce artificially. The joinery was mortise and tenon throughout, cut by hand, which took longer than she expected, and produced the tightest fit she had managed on anything she had made. The back was curved in a way she had worked out on paper over 3 evenings, and then tested in cardboard before committing to the wood. When it was finished, she set it in the middle of the garage and sat in it. It was right. Not perfect. She could already see 3 things she would do differently on the next one. But right in the way, that means the thing you made corresponds to the thing you intended, which is the standard that matters. Her neighbor Harriet knocked on the side door 2 days later, drawn by some combination of the open garage door and the cessation of the sounds that had been coming from it for 6 weeks. She came in and looked at the chair. She walked around it. She sat in it. She stood up and looked at it again. She said, "Frances, where did you buy this?" Frances said, "I made it." Harriet looked at her. Then she looked at the chair again. Then she said, "I want one. How much?" Frances had not thought about how much. She had not thought about selling it. She thought about it for a moment and named a number that seemed to her reasonable, given the materials and the time, which was lower than it should have been, because she had not yet learned to value her time at its actual worth, which takes most people longer to learn than it should. Harriet said, "I will take 2. Can you make 2? Frances said, "Yes." She made 2. Then Harriet told her book club about the chairs, and 2 women from the book club came to look and ordered 1 each. Then one of those women mentioned it to her daughter, who mentioned it to a colleague who designed interiors in Nashville and drove to Millbrook on a Saturday to see the garage and sat in the chair and asked Frances if she had a website. Frances did not have a website. She had a chair and an empty garage on Sycamore Street and a list on the kitchen table with 12 items on it, most of which she had now attended to. Claire built the website. She drove down from Portland for a weekend in February, 16 months after the divorce was finalized, and photographed the chair and the table and the cutting boards and the box and the shelf and the walnut side table she had retrieved from Daniel's apartment for the weekend, with Daniel's baffled cooperation, and she built a website that was simple and clean and showed the work without trying to explain it, which was the right decision because the work did not need explaining. The name on the website was Calloway Studio. Frances had not thought about a name. Claire had suggested it, and Frances had looked at it for a moment and said, "That is good." She had spent 35 years with that name attached to a marriage, and now it was going to be attached to something she had made with her own hands in the garage on Sycamore Street. She found she did not mind. The name was hers too. The website went live on a Sunday evening in February. By Wednesday, there were 11 inquiries. By the following Monday, there were 43. Frances read them at the kitchen table on Monday morning, and then called Claire and said, "What have you done?" Claire said, "I may have submitted the portfolio to a couple of craft publications, just to see." Frances said, "Claire." Claire said, "Mom, look at the chair." Frances looked at the chair. She had put it in the kitchen because the garage was cold in February, and she had wanted it somewhere she could see it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "All right." Then she went to the garage and opened the door and started working. The craft publications ran the portfolio in their spring issues. One of them, a national magazine with a readership that Frances had not been aware of, but that Claire described as significant, ran a short profile that included a photograph of Frances in the garage with the chair, and a caption that described her as a former English teacher who had taken up woodworking after a difficult year, and whose work had attracted attention in design circles. Frances read the caption and thought, "That is approximately true." She filed the magazine on the shelf above the workbench and went back to work. The street noticed. Millbrook was a town of 4,000 people, and Sycamore Street was a street where people knew each other well enough to notice when something changed. And what had changed on Sycamore Street was that the garage of the house where Martin Calloway's tools had hung on a pegboard for 35 years now had its door open most mornings, and the sounds coming out of it were different from the sounds that had come out of it before, and the woman working inside it was different from the woman she had been a year and a half ago in ways that were difficult to specify but were visible. People stopped. Not intrusively. The people of Sycamore Street had the tact of a community that had been living in proximity for long enough to understand the difference between interest and intrusion. But they stopped. They looked. They asked what she was making, and she showed them, and they said things that she noted and appreciated, and that confirmed something she had been discovering about the work. That a well-made thing invites attention in a way that is different from a decorative thing. That people who know nothing about woodworking can recognize the quality of a well-made piece in the same way they recognize the quality of a well-written sentence, not by being able to explain it, but by responding to it. Harriet Webb had become a regular presence at the side door of the garage. She brought coffee on Saturday mornings and sat on the stool Frances had built for visitors. A simple thing, the first piece she had made that she was fully satisfied with, and talked while Frances worked, which was a thing Frances had not known she needed until it was offered. Harriet was 71 and had been widowed 4 years earlier and had a directness that Frances had always appreciated and that had become, in the past year, something she relied on. Harriet said one Saturday, watching Frances fit a drawer into a cabinet she had been building for 3 weeks, "You are a different person than you were when Martin left." Frances did not look up from the drawer. She said, "I know." Harriet said, "It is not because he left." Frances said, "I know that too." Harriet said, "Good," and drank her coffee. Martin drove past the house one afternoon in the spring. Frances did not see him. She was in the garage with the door open and did not notice the car. But Harriet, who had a clear view of the street from her front porch, saw it and mentioned it the following Saturday with the neutral delivery of someone reporting a fact rather than stirring something. She said, "Martin drove past on Thursday, slowly." Frances said, "Did he?" Harriet said, "He did. He slowed down at the garage. He looked for a while, then he drove on." She paused. He did not look like a man who was pleased with himself. Frances considered this. Then she said, "Good," and went back to the cabinet. The letter from the American Craft Council arrived on a Thursday in October, 2 years and 3 months after the divorce was finalized. Frances had heard of the American Craft Council. She had not expected to hear from them, The letter informed her that Calloway Studio had been selected as a recipient of the Council's Emerging Maker Award, a recognition given annually to craftspeople who had demonstrated exceptional skill and artistic vision in their work. The award came with a sum of money that Frances read twice to make sure she was reading it correctly, an invitation to exhibit at the Council's national show in New York in the spring, and a statement that her chairs in particular had been cited by the selection committee as among the most significant pieces of American studio furniture they had reviewed in several years. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time. Then she called her father. He was 93 now, and his hearing was not what it had been, but his mind was entirely itself. She told him about the letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Read it to me again." She read it again. He was quiet. Then he said, "Well?" She said, "Well?" He said, "You built your own bench." She said, "Yes." He said, "From the beginning, you built your own bench." She said, "Yes, Dad." He said, "That is the important thing. Everything else follows from that." She called Claire. Claire made a sound that was not a word but contained everything. She said, "Mom, the American Craft Council." Frances said, "I know." Claire said, "Do you understand what that is?" Frances said, "I am beginning to." Claire said, "I am coming for the exhibition." Frances said, "I assumed you would." Claire said, "Daniel is coming too." Frances said, "Good." She told Harriet on Saturday morning. Harriet sat on the stool with her coffee and listened to the full account and then said, "Of course they did." Frances said, "Harriet, it is the American Craft Council." Harriet said, "I know what it is. I looked it up after I saw the magazine piece." She looked at Frances. She said, "I have been watching you work in this garage for 2 years. Did you think I was not paying attention?" Frances said, "I did not know you looked it up." Harriet said, "Frances, I looked everything up. I have been telling everyone I know about you for 6 months. I am very nearly the reason you have a waiting list." Frances stared at her. Harriet drank her coffee. She drove to New York in May, with 4 chairs and a cabinet, and the small side table in walnut she had retrieved from Daniel again, which he surrendered with much less reluctance this time, now that he understood what it was. Claire flew in from Portland. Daniel took the train from Chicago. They met at the exhibition hall the morning of the opening, and Frances walked them through the space where her work had been installed and watched her children look at what she had made with the particular quality of attention that people give to things they are genuinely seeing for the first time. Daniel sat in one of the chairs. He sat in it the way Harriet had sat in the first chair. He walked around it first, and then sat in it, and then stood up and looked at it again. He said, "Mom, I knew it was good. I did not know it was this good." Frances said, "They are better than the table I sent you." He said, "I know. I want one of these now." She said, "You are on the waiting list." He said, "I'm your son." She said, "You are 5th on the waiting list." The exhibition ran for 3 days. People came and looked and sat in the chairs and talked to Frances with the specific quality of attention that the work attracted, which was not the attention of people being polite, but the attention of people who had been stopped by something and wanted to understand what had stopped them. She answered their questions about the work and about process and about the wood and the joinery, and she did not talk about how she had come to be standing in an exhibition hall in New York with her chairs, because that was not what the work was about. The work was about the work. The rest was how it had happened to get there. A furniture gallery in Nashville approached her on the second day. A design publication asked for an interview. A craftsperson whose work she had admired for 2 years introduced himself and asked if she would be interested in teaching a workshop. Just one. Just to share the approach she had developed with the chair form. She said she would think about it. She thought about it on the drive back to Millbrook. Claire asleep in the passenger seat, the Tennessee hills coming back after the flat distance of the interstate, familiar and green in the May afternoon. She thought about what her father had said. You built your own bench. Everything follows from that. She thought about the bare pegboard with the ghost outlines of the tools, the oil stain on the concrete floor, the humming fluorescent tube, the garage that had been emptied and had been waiting. She said yes to the workshop. She ran it on 4 Saturdays in October, in the garage on Sycamore Street, with 6 students who drove from Nashville and Knoxville, and one from as far as Memphis, because the waiting list for the workshop had been longer than the space would accommodate, and she had chosen the 6 with the attention she brought to everything. Teaching woodworking turned out to use the same part of her that teaching English had used, which was the part that could see what someone did not yet know and find a way to show it to them that corresponded to how they actually learned rather than how the subject theoretically should be learned. She had spent 35 years doing that with language, and she did it now with wood. And the satisfaction was the same in its essential quality, different only in the material. The gallery in Nashville took 6 pieces on consignment. The design publication ran the interview in its November issue with a photograph of the garage on Sycamore Street. Door open, the interior organized and purposeful, the workbench Frances had built that first month visible in the background. The caption read, Frances Calloway, Millbrook, Tennessee. She had seen her name in print for 35 years as a byline on school committee reports and curriculum documents. This was different. Her father visited in the spring. He was 93, and the drive from his house was not something he could manage alone. But Claire had come down for the occasion and driven him, and he walked into the garage on a Saturday morning with the careful steps of his age and stood in the middle of it and looked at everything for a long time without saying anything. He looked at the workbench she had built that first month. He looked at the tools on the pegboard, her tools now, arranged in their places with the same outline and marker system Martin had used, because it was a good system, and she had always known it was a good system. He looked at the chair in the corner, the third version of the design, the one she was currently satisfied with and expected to revise again within the year. He said, Your joinery is better than mine was at your age. She said, That is not true. He said, I know what my joinery was at your age. Yours is better. She said, I had a good teacher. He looked at her. He said, You had a start. You did the rest yourself. She said, Dad. He said, I mean it. This is yours. All of it. Every bit of it is yours. She thought about that in the weeks after he went home, about what it meant to build something that was entirely yours. Not because no one had helped. Claire had built the website. Harriet had told everyone she knew. Her father had described the workbench over the phone. Her students in those first workshops had asked questions that made her understand her own work more clearly. People had helped. But the thing itself, the hours in the garage, the mistakes and the corrections, the 6 weeks with the cherry wood, the hand-cut mortise and tenon joints, the decision to try again, and the decision to stop and look, and the decision to keep going, that had been hers. Entirely and only hers. The garage door was open most mornings now. This was the thing the street had noticed first, and continued to notice. Not because it was unusual for a garage door to be open, but because of what came out of it. The sounds of work, the smell of wood. And occasionally, in the late morning when the light came in at the right angle and the work was going well, the particular quiet that settles over a space where someone is doing exactly what they are meant to be doing. Harriet still came on Saturday mornings with coffee. The stool was still in its place by the side door. Some things, Frances had decided, you do not change when they are right. On a Saturday morning in November, 3 years after Martin walked out with the tools and the workbench and the cabinets and the shop vacuum and the extension cords on their orange reels, Frances sat in the chair, the third version, the one she was currently satisfied with, and drank her coffee and looked at the garage around her. The tools on the pegboard, the workbench she had built that first month, the wood stacked along the east wall, sorted by species and thickness, the sketches pinned above the bench for the piece she was working on, the smell of cherry and walnut, and the particular mineral smell of hand tools that have been used and oiled and used again. Harriet knocked on the side door and came in, and sat on the stool and handed Frances a second cup. She looked around the garage. She said, Do you remember what this looked like when Martin took everything? Frances said, I do. Harriet said, Do you miss any of it? Frances thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. She said no. Harriet nodded. She drank her coffee. She said, Good. If you have ever stood in an empty room and felt it waiting rather than empty, if you have ever had something taken from you that turned out to be making room for something else, if there is something you have been saying when I have time for longer than you should have, then Frances's story belongs to you, because she did not build a business in that garage. She did not build a reputation, or a waiting list, or a recognition from a national council. She built a bench first, and then a shelf, and then a box, and then a chair that was right. Everything else followed from that. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to begin the thing you have been deferring. That an empty room is not a loss, it is an invitation. That the hands know things the mind has been too busy to remember. Thank you for being here with us today. We will see you in the next story.